Good morning. I salute you, the warriors who made it to the last day of the Charleston conference. Woohoo! Good morning. My name is Meg White, and I am not an attorney, and I'm also not a rapper. So it's a tough act to follow after that last crew, for sure, but I think the panel is up to the task. Just a reminder, please silence your phones and electronic devices. There are plenty of seats here. Folks, make yourselves at home, one of the hallmarks of Charleston. And this session is being recorded. So just FYI, Big Brother is watching. So welcome this morning. We are so glad you joined us, made it to the last day. We are going to talk about, or more accurately, the panel is going to discuss good, bad, or somewhere in between, the impact of market consolidation on libraries and universities. So I am joined here on the stage, I'll just go left to right, by Doug Gray, who is the Dean of Libraries at the University of Kentucky, Roger Schoenfeld, who is Director of Libraries, Scholarly Communication, and Museum Programs at Ithaca, SNR, and Kara Cruz-Lee, who is the Director of Product Management at EBSCO Information Services and has one of the prettiest last names I've heard in a while. So, with those introductions, we are going to kick the panel off. Doug was lucky enough to sit in the hot seat, so I think we're going to keep this interactive. Lots of Q&A between the panelists, and certainly your questions as well. We'll save time for that. But I'd like to start out with Doug, who's going to give us some context.
Sure, thanks, Meg. So I'm just going to provide a little bit of context. I think what generally, hopefully, maybe not, what libraries are thinking about the consolidation we're seeing in the market. And I would say from a library's point of view in general, we find it a pretty disconcerting marketplace right now. I think concerns in the library community center around loss of choice and companies' attempts at both vertical and horizontal integration. I think ProQuest and EBSCO, we would say, dominate the marketplace in ways that I'm not sure are very healthy. Both companies are really just a couple of acquisitions away from really creating a closed loop where they could provide all the libraries, a single library services, from monograph acquisitions, serial acquisitions, databases, streaming videos, ILS, et cetera. In some ways, this could be seen as a positive, streamlining services, but most of us have seen how these closed systems limit choice and how these companies use their power to make it painful for libraries that look to disentangle their business from one of these companies. And on top of that, there are these exclusive arrangements that these vendors enter into with publishers and societies that really limit choice and eliminate competition from our point of view. Of course, this is similar in many ways to what we've been seeing from the major journal publishers, who are certainly looking at lock-in when it comes to researcher workflows and data, and then talk about the information monopolies they have, just the way publishing is set up. That's led to a perverse marketplace that certainly doesn't benefit students, researchers, or our society at large. As an example, I recently moved to University of Kentucky. I was at University of Wisconsin before, and I have one journal publisher that we work with that I won't name, but they might be in the Netherlands. And I spend $500,000 more at Kentucky than I did at Wisconsin for less content. And it's easy to explain how that happens, but it really also goes to show how the marketplace makes zero sense at all, that we're really not paying for goods and services. We are in a really strange environment in that way. And so I think the lack of competition and choice is a huge concern for us. We live in a world where OCLC dominates resource sharing infrastructure, and where they raise our costs at rates that are more than double the inflation on an annual basis, and we have no choice. We see more and more publishers limiting choice when it comes to where we can purchase their ebooks. And I won't spend a lot of time, but I think most libraries would talk about the disaster that is the streaming video marketplace. We have bad actors out there that are working really hard to limit choice. I think most libraries would say choice is good. I'll give a tip of the hat to EBSCO for their investments in Folio. I think we'd be in a really even worse place if Alma was our only choice or an ILS system. In spite of all these concerns, I think we need to acknowledge that, one, consolidation brings benefits to libraries. When Rapid ILL was acquired by Ex Libris last year, my first thought was some words I won't say on the stage, and then I was like, well, at least it wasn't OCLC that bought them. And I thought, well, maybe that's not a good thing or bad. But the reality is when you looked at what happened with Rapid IOL, they were at a point where they did not have the capital to do the technological investments that they needed to have to make that system viable. And I think we'd all be in a worse place without a Rapid IOL. I think the other thing we need to acknowledge for libraries is that we need to expect for-profit companies to act like for-profit companies. That's just the business they're in. In some ways, it's better for at least to acknowledge that than some of the, I would call, these supposed nonprofits that exist in our world that really don't act like nonprofits at all. And yet, libraries, we need to have the ability to push back when actions that companies do aren't in our best interest or they don't align with our values. So what we're going to try to do this morning is take a more nuanced look at the issue. We'll acknowledge the challenges and concerns that come from consolidation, while hopefully highlighting that the world we live in is not black and white and that things are far more complicated than we want to accept.
Right, so Doug definitely mentioned the good, the bad, and the somewhere in between. Opening it up with the panel, is consolidation, is this really growing? Is it accelerating? And what, if so, what would be some of the drivers behind that? Roger, Kara.
So as I've been watching the marketplace in recent years, one of the things that's pretty clear is that consolidation around content is giving way to consolidation around services and platforms and tools. And I think that that's a really important, and consolidation between content and services and platforms and tools. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to bear in mind. It's not just a question of content collections growing and content bundles therefore growing, which they have and may well continue to do. But if you look at the acquisitions that Elsevier and Digital Science and Clarivate have been making, just to take three very prominent examples, you can see very interesting portfolios of analytics and workflow tools that are all coming together under single ownership, or several sets of single ownership. You can see similar kinds of behaviors from most of the major publishing houses, maybe to a slightly lesser degree. And so, you know, what we're seeing is the creation of platform businesses in the scholarly publishing and content sector, in a way trying to purchase up many of the startups that can either add to an integrated workflow offering, provide the data that they crave as they try to become analytics businesses of one sort, and yield some of the integrations across workflows, across researcher workflows, across authorship workflows, across, in some cases, library workflows, that actually make things tremendously more seamless for the individuals in question. In a way, it's sort of like, in some cases, we're even starting to see moves that maybe are a little bit more defensive. So if you think about Facebook's brilliant move to purchase Instagram, which at the time was seen as just a defensive move. We have to buy this startup so that they don't grow to compete with us, and then it's grown substantially under Facebook ownership. We're starting to see some of those kinds of moves as well, which are interesting. So yes, I think the short answer is that it's growing, and I think the drivers are, a lot of the drivers on the platform side are data related on base.
So yeah, I agree with what Roger said, and I was with NetLibrary when EBSCO acquired it, and then I was with EBSCO when they acquired Gobi, so I've been on both sides of the corporate coin, as it were. And one thing that I think is important to remember is that most of these companies being acquired are for sale, and they're for sale for a reason. Either the parent organization has decided not to invest in it and they want to walk away or move in a different direction, or they're simply not thriving on their own. And I think there's two other drivers for that. One is the sheer rate of technological change makes it difficult for smaller companies to keep up. Things like GDPR and increasingly accessibility is a huge and critical technical lift. So that's one reason. And then another driver is just the state of our marketplace. It's stagnant at best. So again, more difficult for smaller companies. So as Doug kind of hinted at, sometimes when you see companies like EBSCO making acquisitions, the net result is a preservation of a service or a company or a product that might otherwise have disappeared.
I think that's an outstanding point, and I think we do see that in a time of transition. There are folks that are valuable in our ecosystem, but are no longer able to, for the reasons that Kara just mentioned, maybe exist on their own. We certainly saw, to Roger's point yesterday, with the plenary address from Elsevier, that they absolutely, while content is still king, that was stated, the analytics piece of the business is becoming increasingly important, and one way for them to do that and become more innovative is to make an acquisition. So, moving on, Doug mentioned some of the bad and the somewhere in between. Kara may be getting there, but what can we identify as some of the positives coming out of this consolidation? Specifically for libraries, are there advantages?
So I think one of those advantages is certainly the investment that comes into these products. Kara mentioned EBSCO's acquisition of YBP, and while I don't think many of us were thrilled with that, at the same time, those of us that tried to work with YBP for many years on innovative new products were constantly frustrated by the slow rate of change and the lack of resources that Yankee had to invest in things. I'm going back thinking about when we went to just multi-vendor DDA. It was a slow and painful process to be able to get that up and running, and it was really about resource allocations there. And so certainly we've seen improvements and in products when they're acquired by, frankly, a more well-resourced company in that way. So I think that's certainly a piece there. And I think there are some streamlining of workflows can be a real positive for us as well. And so it does save us time, especially on the back end when we have fewer and fewer people that we want to dedicate to back of the house operations.
One more thing I would add to that is the importance, I guess, of stability. When you think about library services, content services in particular, these are services whose longevity is critically important. We have perpetual access obligations that are intended to be viable over the very, very long term. And that's just simply easier for a long-standing large company to provide. And just a few years ago, there was a publisher platform of ebooks that wanted to provide services directly to libraries, host their own content. And when they found that they couldn't sustain that arrangement any longer, they contacted EBSCO, and we agreed to take on their hosting and their provisioning of access. So I think that's an example of a case where it's a positive to at least have some stable actors that can provide that kind of force where there might otherwise be a significant disruption.
And I think that it's important to recognize that in some cases acquisitions or mergers yield services that remains largely separate from one another inside of a portfolio. But increasingly, I think we're seeing cases where the benefits of bringing what have been disparate services together can drive incredible efficiencies on the user side, on the customer side. So if you think about the discovery to access workflows that users have that have been so difficult and complicated, as we bring more content onto a given platform or more discovery services and so forth onto a single platform, that has can have some enormous user side benefits. If you think about the authorship, the research and authorship and data management and pre-printing and peer reviewing and publishing, that set of workflows on the research and author side, tremendously fragmented user experiences that require data re-entry and no one knows where things are and so to the extent that companies are able to drive greater seamlessness, there's an efficiency gain, there's real cost reductions on the user side, on the customer side. And those have because those are economic interests, there's a certain kind of inevitability to them that I think we have to kind of recognize that even if they're strategically problematic, we actually, there's a certain logic to them that's going to keep drawing us towards. Maybe there's other ways to get that seamlessness, but towards increasing efficiencies. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add on top of that. I mean, I really think, especially when we think about the things that Elsevier is doing, I think it is really interesting when we think about our researchers' workflows, and they really are bringing efficiencies. It's also very scary based on their past practice, what they're doing, and I think what we see at universities is they may not be even aware that they're starting to acquire one single company's suite of services as they start to buy up different types of services, but. At least for the research universities I've been at, researcher workflows is really a growing importance to us in trying to be efficiency. And then on the back side of that, the ability to leverage the data that is being gathered up together. The research offices find that incredibly valuable and really quite important there. And I think a lot of our concerns are really out of fear, but we have to acknowledge that the benefits that those are really bringing to our campus.
And that certainly would be an entirely new role, a very important one that the library can play. Not just in the procurement of the resources that are needed, but in helping to give analytics and feedback on the workflows and the activities that are going on within their community. So maybe an opportunity there, something that's coming down the pike. What can the library community do, if anything, to encourage the good consolidation, we'll use that, and perhaps resist those that might be not as benevolent in nature?
So I think there are a number of different categories here. Two that I'm going to highlight are number one, standards for interoperability, which is a tricky one because interoperability almost always cuts against agility in terms of innovative sort of product innovation and feature innovation. So I'm not sure we know what that might look like, but right now there are essentially no standards for interoperability for many of the different categories of services that I think we're all thinking about on this panel. So identifying where there might be some critical roles or services where we could actually ensure that competition can take place because of a certain standard for interoperability. I think that would be one thing for the community to give some thought to, and to give thought to it not from the perspective of this is a service that we want to have modularized, but rather this is a service that if it were able to be modularized, it would make it harder for the platforms to have a monopolistic position. I think that's a different way of thinking about the purpose of interoperability. And ultimately the goal is to ensure competition in the marketplace. I mean, I think that's the key thing to think about. When libraries make purchasing decisions individually or collectively, they rarely think about the longer term marketplace effects of the decisions that they're making. And in one way of thinking, they shouldn't. That's not the point of a negotiation. On the other hand, they tend to make choices individually that add up to decisions that don't always have the outcomes that collectively they're looking for. And I think there's a certain kind of problem in that libraries anyway could give more scrutiny to.
Well, and I think the problem that you just described is not exclusive to libraries, right? So all these little individual decisions sometimes have unintended consequences. So, Kara, you were going to comment? I'm sorry.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important for us to think critically about what the impact and the intent of the acquisition is. So sometimes you'll have a transparent attempt to, capture and eliminate a competitor. But other times you can ask, what is the impact? Is this preserving interoperability? Is it preserving choice? it's hard to enforce standards in any other way besides your dollars. And so that can be a kind of market-based resistance, I think, to the bad kind.
And I'll echo what Roger said. I think I was at a session yesterday with Charles Watkinson, and it must be a Michigan term, talked about bibliodiversity, because I've only heard from people from Michigan that use that term. But supporting diversity and competition in the marketplace, and I've always worked really hard to ensure that I don't have all my eggs in one basket. Most of my collections budget flows through EBSCO, because I use EBSCO as my journal jobber, and I use Gobi. But we are very careful to make sure we are not experiencing lock-in where everything is with one company and not trying to enter into agreements that we think are going to be very hard to disentangle in that way. So I think being very cognizant about as you make the choices of where are you going to do your business and making sure that you keep some diversity and so in terms of the suppliers you work with there, in spite of some of the benefits that come to putting all your dollars going with one, those discounts and efficiencies that come there. I think the other thing libraries should do is really, we need to make sure we're speaking up and voicing our concerns and being very active there. Certainly I know when EBSCO and MLA entered into the exclusive deal, I think that was 2 years ago after ALA, and made the announcement, frankly, after ALA at the very end of that conference to avoid, in my opinion, to avoid challenging conversations that would have taken place. I made sure that EBSCO knew that I was very unhappy, and I let MLA know I was unhappy, and to EBSCO's credit, at least they responded. MLA just ignored my concerns. So speaking up and voicing your concerns, just think about the same time in your libraries. You think we have no power, but when a faculty member or even a student comes and voices a very strong complaint at our libraries, we always pay attention. We always respond to those strong complaints that come in there. It's the same side on the vendor side. I think Carrie or other vendors would speak to that. They listen to the concerns we have. And I think the last thing I would say is doing values-based expenditures and partnerships. If we have companies that we think are being bad actors in the marketplace, let's think about whether we want to spend our money with them and whether we want to pull that money away. And I think certainly we've seen that happening for many libraries in the streaming video marketplace, where we see one company that's being very unresponsive to our needs and not listening to us and really working to create exclusive distribution of streaming video. Many of us, or most of us, are pulling away, frankly, I know in the Big Ten, certainly north of $1 million, and expressing our displeasure with our dollars. And then I would say being careful with partnerships. And so, and asking lots of questions and saying, does this partnership and what a company's trying to do match our values? An example I'll use here, just try to be an equal offender, is with Rialto. So when I was in Wisconsin, Ex Libris approached us to be a development partner on Rialto. And we asked lots of questions about really, would this product be interoperable? A lot of things Rialto looks to do, data-driven workflows, is something that I personally have been writing about and talking about for a very long time, so I was very excited. At the same time, I was very concerned that Ex Libris seemed to be looking to create a closed marketplace that they use Alma to drive your purchasing decisions. And yes, I use Gobi, but I also use Alma Livre, and I use Harasowitz, and I use lots of other book vendors. And the questions I asked over and over again was, is this going to work with other people? And frankly, it took many phone calls to get an answer that at that point in time was no. Now, whether that's going to change in the future, I don't know. Hopefully, Ex Libris listens to those concerns and will go a different route to, again, look toward interoperability. But I think we have to be careful about saying, do we want to enter in partnerships with different things that might be good, but if they don't match the values of things that we care about, should we be doing that? Should we be supporting those with, frankly, our time and our effort, as well as our dollars?
I'm just going to add one more observation on that question, which is that there's a huge explosion of startups in our space and in the scholarly publishing and academic library spaces right now. You're all walking around with, looking out at the audience. I can see you're all advertising for right around your necks. And just as one example of many really interesting and innovative companies that are doing good work, whether it be on discovery or analytics or any number of topics. To the extent that these questions about mergers and acquisitions and consolidation matter to you and your libraries, librarians should be asking hard questions of these startups about, who owns you? What's your business plan? What's my assurance that you're going to keep the scrappy, independent mindset that you currently have? And often there isn't a good answer to that question. There can't be, because the goal is, you know, some kind of opportunity to monetize the business. So I think there's, I think that's something to, you know, just be mindful of, especially in this kind of startup-rich landscape.
So it's interesting. We didn't actually talk about this on the phone. So it's an interesting observation, because I've actually had the opposite concern, that I feel like there's fewer startups and fewer newer companies, and I worry that the grip that the major publishers and that EBSCO and ProQuest has is actually making it harder. So I think it's an interesting observation, because I've almost felt it's the opposite, and I feel like when I go to ALA and I go on the floor, that there's fewer and fewer choices, and then maybe that's just about the fact that ALA is so expensive, and there's not that much more money in the library marketplace, so it might be an ALA issue more than anything in reality.
Yeah, so I think if you look, so that may be right on the library side, but if you look at the explosion of startups that are bringing AI kinds of methods into the scholarly publishing environment, it looks very, very different right now. And I think that will wash over to library-facing products and businesses before too long.
And what Roger just described is just a function of the new technology that can come into the space. You know, we're far past the days of publishing content, and back from my publishing days, and sort of throwing it over the wall and hoping people could find it and do something with it. These days, the technology enables so much more. And that's where I think you start to see the innovation coming. Can we support these users better? What are their needs, and what is the opportunity there, both for for-profit companies and non-profit companies? I appreciated Roger's comments about interoperability, and I think it's counterintuitive. You know, if there's only one flavor, then the playing field is equal, right? If everybody can work together, then you have to build product and services that are exclusive to you on top of those standards, and then the market really does start to see choice between. So, sort of interesting. So, we're going to save some time for questions, but just for the panel, I will ask you always the crystal ball question. If you could say what the future might hold in this area. We're not going to hold you to it, so.
I do see more, not less, unfortunately, consolidation, and that's concerning. Of course, as a consumer as well, it's the same thing outside of the library industry. But I was trying to think of something positive, and one thing that I think might be an outcome of some of our budgetary challenges is that vendors are going to be forced to deliver, in some cases, smaller and smaller units of value and sort of unbundle some of their services. And if we're doing that, then that might be good for competition, because it could lower the barrier for entry for new players.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out positive spins as well. I sort of struggled a little bit. 'Cause nothing seems to suggest that consolidation is going to slow down. Again, as mentioned before, I think we're seeing vendors start trying to strengthen their lock-in. And again, Rialto, I think, is a prime example of that. And we're continuing to see a loss of choice for us in the library community. I think we are seeing some community-based responses to this, and primarily I'm thinking about Reshare as a response to OCLC's stranglehold on resource sharing infrastructure. But at the same time, I'm also concerned, I'm getting pessimistic as I get older. I'm concerned about the long-term viability of our community-owned projects. I'm thinking about DPEN and DPLA. Those went really well and flamed out amazingly. And the membership fatigue we see in libraries, and frankly at our universities, where we're being asked to justify all these memberships we have. And I really, frankly, personally believe the free market is really needed to provide us with solutions to our problems there. I don't think community-owned solutions are the solution to all of our problems in the library. But I also think we really need a healthy and functioning marketplace to give us choices and options there. And so I think it's up to us in the library community to continue to voice our concerns and to make sure that the companies we work with are listening and understand our values and our priorities.
So, you know, if you look at some of the big events recently that have taken place that might affect what the future looks like, one of them that I think about is Clarivate's public listing, which just happened a couple of months ago. And, you know, some of the ways in which moving from being a private company to a public company seems to have shifted some of the incentives that they have and some of the strategic directions that they may be pursuing. And I think that those kinds of things are really interesting, because ultimately a lot of what's driving this are a set of financial considerations that aren't really in our control, and certainly you know, to libraries aren't often very visible. And I think that the future almost certainly holds you know, a lot more startups, a lot more innovation, a lot more you know, creativity. I think we've seen a few startups that have announced products just at this conference, actually. I think we're also likely to see more consolidation. We saw Brewster announcing that he'd bought Better World Books, and everyone cheered, and I don't pretend to fully understand that model, but that's an example of consolidation, right? Maybe for good. The future certainly holds a lot more, you know, efforts to bring things together, to create greater value, to save some of the failing our failing friends, and I think, you know, I think that mix between startup and innovation and consolidation and size and scale is what we're going to continue to see. But the seamlessness, it's my view that the seamlessness is ultimately going to drive us towards more and more fewer and fewer larger and larger offerings. And thinking about what that means as a customer is to my mind the biggest question of all.
All right, well, we thank the panel, and now we invite your questions for these folks on the topic. Oh, we've got one already. So please just state your name and your affiliation, and the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Mary Ellen Sloan. I'm the science librarian at Middle Tennessee State University. And since there's nobody else up, I'm gonna ask two questions, and you all can answer whichever one you want, and we'll just take it that way. First one is, I've just noticed, you know, Discovery Systems seems to have created some standardization in interfaces. I remember doing library instruction, you know, 10 or 15 years ago, and you had to say, well, in this interface, the facets are over here, and this one, it's over here, and it seems like it's been maybe a good benefit because, you know, vendors are sort of agreeing that how things should be laid out, and our users are benefiting from that. So that's my first, if you just, any of you want to comment on that thought. But secondly, I'm going to put on my hat of our continuing resources staff members right now, and her name is Tony, and she complains constantly about the inefficiency of dealing with vendors who have, you know, it's one, I won't call it anybody because they're probably in the room. Well, I know they're in the room, but you know, oh, we have a different person for that, and that person's new, and that person just left, and she's constantly keeping our ERM updated with contacts. And I feel like the vendors need to come up with some kind of concierge for this, because we're taking on more and more workload helping them just keep their personnel management, you know, tuned up. And it's so inefficient. And, you know, we mentioned earlier, the long arm of the long mentioned the accessibility. We have to now demonstrate that these interfaces meet whatever accessibility standards, and we're having to do a whole lot of workload for that too. That's adding on. So sorry to be a little bit of a complainer there, but I think this is a good opportunity to express that our workload in-house is being impacted.
And, you know, the panel, we really didn't discuss that, the sort of disruption. Kara mentioned that she'd been through a couple of mergers and acquisitions. So that's a very important question. So I don't know what the answer would be. I'll turn that over to the experts.
I can speak a little bit to that just from the vendor side. I think we're seeing a huge transition from more content-based companies to more service-based companies, and that requires a lot more customer service. And so it's difficult, I will tell you, to manage the level and the type and the quantity of services that we're trying to provide for you all as you need to, reallocate your time and energy elsewhere. So that's a challenge and something that I think all companies are going to have to grapple with and improve on.
And I'll just observe one thing, which is that it doesn't matter who the vendor was that you're referring to, and I'd rather not know. But if you are hearing, if you're observing that a given vendor has an inordinate amount of frontline staff turnover in a very short amount of time, like how does that serve as an input into your broader strategic thinking about what to do? And I'll just leave that as a question without trying to answer it right now.
I'm Bob Sandusky, University of Illinois at Chicago. And I'm thinking of a few threads here. One is some of the things that the panel mentioned about interoperability. And then I'm also thinking about possible differences in cultures and attitudes. Libraries have a long tradition of collaboration, developing consortia, and trying to do things together to stretch budgets as far as we possibly can. And then on the other side, on the vendor side, about which I know far less, are there things in vendor culture that prevent or stand in the way of interoperability or sharing data that might be hard won but could actually benefit if it were made openly available to innovators or libraries themselves? That could be from usage kinds of statistics or even metadata that you've created. Are vendors thinking about that?
Yeah, I think there will always be some kind of financial incentive to create closed systems and to not share your data or to not be interoperable, and you will learn that if you look at some business school tenets. But from the EBSCO perspective, over the last few years with what's happened with Alma and Folio, and then also, frankly, as we got in the books business and started working closely with university presses whose futures are all but certain in some cases, we started to realize that when players fail and fall down, that's bad for all of us. It's bad for publishers, for libraries, even for vendors. So we're trying to take the tack where interoperability and preserving library choice is a primary strategy, because we just feel like that healthy ecosystem will ultimately benefit all of us in the long run. Yeah, that's all.
I just to add on here, and my company is an aggregator in a health sciences space. I think it gets back to you're always going to want to have proprietary services. However, the benefits, as Roger said, and I never really thought of it this way, so I appreciate your comments, of that level playing field, and then companies who are innovative can create those special tools and services on top. What you share and what you don't share, especially in a for-profit environment, is always going to be, that's your strategy, right? I mean, part of it.
Yeah, and I guess on that point in particular, I think there's a difference between becoming interoperable and trying to work in a partnership way with other services, and then giving away an asset that you've invested in creating. So it's a little bit different there, I would say.
Jeff Grossman from Xavier University. Kara, I think you might have touched on this a little bit, but one of the things I think a lot of us might be looking at institutionally is that coming demographic cliff of declining students, and I wonder how maybe the panel might think that will affect this trend. Is it an accelerant, or will it create other changes?
Happy to start. Yeah, that the enrollment crisis is not looking good for any of us. I think when we look at, I think for a while we hoped that higher education budgets would bounce back, and I don't think that's going to happen. So one, I think, interesting thing that will happen as a disruptor is that a lot of our models, current models for content, are being flipped on their head. So open access is one outcome of that for sure. Things that will reduce costs because there is no more budget anymore. Doug, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think this is going to be a driver in the marketplace because there are no more dollars to go around. So there's just one set of dollars that aren't really increasing at all. Flat is good these days. And as we look at what's coming around the bend, which is really, for me, I think, AI and AR and how those are going to impact libraries, and how do we find the funds to support those, what will likely be commercial solutions and products that will support those types of things. It's going to come from someplace else, which means there are going to be winners and losers, which then creates opportunities for continued consolidation of services.
We're going to bounce right over here quickly.
Well, and I apologize in advance. Hi, Amy Harris, MIT Press, for something that's sort of a comment and also waving the university press flag. Just to remind folks, too, that there are other university partners who are experiencing the same sorts of consolidation. The recent acquisition of editorial manager, Aries, by Elsevier, has affected us a lot. Also, our journals are on the Adipon platform, which was years ago bought by Wiley. So I also would just encourage you to think about how other campus collaborators might be experiencing the same things, working on solutions together, which is something I know my director is very keen on, and we're extremely lucky in that, as some of you may have attended the panel yesterday with Nick Lindsay and Catherine Dunn, but the MIT Libraries is using their collection budgets to do something truly transformative with us. And so you may have other partners on campus who are thinking about these issues, nonprofit values, and interested in collaborating.
Sir, please. Was he first? Please, sir.
Thanks, Chuck. My name's Tony Zanders. I'm with Boston University. Wanted to get comments from the panel on the diversification of these product lines within a company across the industry. All vendors that are being consolidated, they're diversifying their product lines. The traditional buyer, which typically in the library is sort of becoming more of a minority in the decision-making power structure in the university. And I'm wondering if the diversification of product lines is sort of a second-order effect of that, is potentially displacing the library's strength and sort of value in the university context. And so, does market consolidation have a third-order sort of threat there?
So certainly I can speak to that in the case of some of the researcher workflow tools that, for example, Elsevier has invested substantially in analytics and showcasing tools where, and others, I mean, Ex Libris in its Esploro offering is another example, where publishers or vendors that have traditionally faced almost exclusively to the library now have products and services that the research office is interested in. And even if the vendors and publishers behave in ways that are promoting the library in that process, which they may not always choose to do, the fact of the matter is that they're going to be talking to lots of other offices on campus, naturally, the provost's office, the research office, et cetera. And I think one of the challenges there, it may not be that leads to budgetary reallocation, though it may be that it does. But one of the challenges is that those offices are not always, the library and those offices are not always aligned in what they're looking for, what their decision-making principles are, what their negotiating abilities are, their strategic directions are, and there's a lot of internal misalignments on many campuses that I think are disadvantaging the universities relative to these really cool new product suites that are out there. And so, Tony, I totally believe strongly that there's work to be done at many universities there. Yeah.
I was hoping that we might get that kind of a question, so thank you so much.
I'm just curious if the panelists would care to speculate. Oh, I'm Joe Esposito, senior partner with Clark and Esposito. I'm curious if the panel would care to speculate about mega mergers, not something like Elsevier buying Ares, which is a pretty small deal, but when you look at the large commercial firms, EBSCO, ProQuest, Informa, Taylor Francis, Elsevier, Wiley, Walters, Kluwer, 2 or 3 others, do we anticipate, or are you anticipating any further consolidation among the big fellers?
No, go ahead.
Kara, do you have an announcement you'd like to make on behalf of EBSCO?
I actually was told this week that there was a rumor about that, but no, I mean, at least with EBSCO, we're a privately family-owned company, believe it or not. But I think at least being in the library space, there is that type of merger anyways. The first thing that I think of is that the library community would revolt, and it would be, quote, bad for business. So there's at least some kind of, I think, incentive against that.
Just to point out, there is a large merger between 2 big people happening, McGraw-Hill and Cengage. Now, that's more in the educational space, and that is a case of 2 companies that were flailing and, you know, certainly too big to fail. They're trying to put that together now. So I think given the reason that the panel so accurately outlined, I don't think you can rule that out. It is certainly a time of transition. So I don't know, I'll kickstart it with that.
To me, it seems I keep on waiting for EBSCO or for ProQuest to buy Harassowitz. Frankly, I keep on saying someday I'll be right, and it seems like it's like frankly Canopy or Films on Demand is right for EBSCO to purchase because again, it starts to complete the portfolio and the gaps in their portfolio, and those aren't really I wouldn't call those mega acquisitions. Roger could probably speak to this more. I think some of the venture capital that's out there, the companies are owned by venture capital. Whether that's going to make it more likely or less likely, I don't know in that way. I don't know if you have thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly where I was going. Is there's several major companies that, among which you mentioned, Joe, that are private equity owned that are ultimately looking for an exit strategy over time, and whether that will be an IPO in 1 or 2 of those cases, as Springer Nature tried, but as I think many of you will know, their IPO failed a year or so ago, and so you have Springer Nature, you have ProQuest, a couple of others on that list that and with Clarivate now public, but I think still looking for the next big set of acquisitions that it will make, or perhaps the next big merger that it will enter into. I think there's some real room for recombinations. It'll be interesting to see what the future holds.
We're slightly over, so if you want to leave, that's fine, but we'll handle one more question quickly.
So my name's Karen Wyckoff from Ithaca College Library, and I have more of an observation going back to the subject of the impact of mergers on customer service and your reps. I will date myself in saying that I lament the days when I had one rep for 10 and 12 years and I got to make a relationship with that person that worked really well for me. Now I have a point person who never knows the answer to my question and has to pass me off to the person who handles this part of the business and that part of the business and the other part. Or I have a generic email that I write to and I never know who's going to answer it, and they don't know the history of what has already been discussed. And I'd just like to suggest to vendors, this is a problem too, so when you're thinking about it, take feedback from your library customers and ask us what we need and want from customer service.
Well, great point, and one that I hadn't considered prior to the panel. So we thank you. Terrific. I learned a lot. I hope the audience did. We're grateful for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.